Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits using technology. Joining me today is Ansley Fender to talk about grants. Ansley, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I'm curious to know, one of my favorite questions to ask at the beginning is, what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
So, kind of accidentally, actually. So I grew up as a musician and a dancer, and so I just grew up around nonprofits before I realized that that's what they were. And so when I was in college, I ended up studying nonprofit management. I kind of fell into it. I did a couple other things and then sort of ended up in nonprofit management and didn't realize how it had just been like this long tail thing that I had always been in. I just didn't know that's what it was called when I was a child. So all the way back to like literally 4 years old, I've been in and around nonprofits and involved in fundraisers and things like that.
Awesome. That's actually a really cool story to it's like this is life. Life is about, volunteering, helping the community, having an impact. That's actually a wonderful life experience to have. I'm kind of envious a little bit actually.
Yeah, definitely.
So recently you decided to start, and I guess the company name used to be called Atlas. Today it's Grantcycle. What was the decision-making process behind this organization?
So when I graduated college, I actually immediately started a master's in public finance, which has absolutely nothing to do with nonprofits. And I got about one semester shy of graduating, and then my oldest daughter was born. And it's really hard to like go to school and raise a 4-week-old baby. So I just didn't go back to finish my final semester. So I was home with her and was thinking through, I have these life experiences, I have this education, I have this skill set. What in the world can I do with this? And the town I was living in had actually a really, really high like nonprofits per capita relative to equally sized cities, like pretty small city, but tons of nonprofits. And so I just started talking to them about, what they needed and things. And most of it was centered around finance. They needed help with bookkeeping and financial consulting and generating, reports for their board and understanding those reports and all that kind of stuff. So I started doing financial consulting and bookkeeping and things for nonprofits. And about a year or so into that, someone asked me if I could help them manage their grants. And I was like, I don't know what that is. Like, I'm a 22-year-old consultant. I don't really know much of anything. But yeah, for sure, I can figure that out. And so I started managing their grants. And, this was almost 10 years ago, and really kind of fell in love with like where finance meets impact. And so I was doing a lot of manual grant management and spreadsheets like most organizations do. And it became really, really clear that it was just not solving the problem. There was no amount of custom spreadsheet building that was going to fix grant management or make it not really expensive and time consuming. So this was around 2020, and there wasn't a whole lot to do in 2020, being at home. So I basically was like, hey, I've got to find a way to productize what I've been doing. And I don't know how to code. I'm good at technology. I've always been big on like design and things, but it's still a big learning curve to actually build software. But there was literally nothing else to do. So that's what I did. I started, which, like you said, was Atlas at the time. Started Grantcycle and built the software, designed and built like 80+% of it myself. And then we just kind of haven't looked back.
And first of all, it's impressive to actually learn a software technology and then implement it. And you said 80%. Can I ask, just out of curiosity, what was the language and database you're using to build it?
Yeah. So there's been this really interesting movement in software because learning to code is so, so difficult. It's like learning another language, except with learning another language, you can speak it like verbally with other people or read it or write it. There's so many different ways to learn a language and to immerse yourself in a language. With code, you are typing it. You're not speaking it. And you're communicating with a computer that can't exactly communicate back to you in like a conversational type of way. So there's really, really steep learning curve. There's a lot of gatekeeping in that industry. And so there's been this huge movement called low code or no code to make it more accessible. So like what Figma did to Adobe with design, making design like for the common man. And so all of these companies have come out with this low code movement. And there's one in particular called Bubble It's about a 10-year-old company, which when you think about the low code movement it's an incredibly old company, one of the first movers, but basically it's object-based coding. So it's much more natural language. You have to understand still how to communicate with a computer, but you don't have to speak to it in ones and zeros or in like Python. There's not a specific front end, back end database language. It's kind of an all-in-one type of thing. So it allowed us to build really, really fast. Like for instance, we can build and launch a new software in 8 hours, or a new feature in 8 hours. We can bug fix in like 2 minutes. So it's a much more dynamic platform to be able to build on faster and cheaper and all that, which obviously we can pass off to customers. So, so the software was built in Bubble. That's how I learned. I, learned also some basic Python and HTML and CSS and things, but not enough to just enough to be dangerous, not enough to actually build a piece of software from scratch.
That's still really impressive. And then, so now that the package is built, is it a SaaS type of situation where you lease out your application to nonprofits to help them with a grant management application, or how does the structure of the application work for clients?
Yeah, so one of the things that I really wanted to bring to Grantcycle was some of the things I learned in my previous company doing, this stuff more manually. And that's that you can't separate out the finance, like the accounting and bookkeeping function, from grant management. They are two sides of the exact same coin. It's money that you're tracking and reporting. You just have very different ways that you're tracking and reporting this stuff. And so, in evaluating why my clients, my previous business weren't using grant management software, it's like, all right, there's still all these holes that aren't being filled. So it's an expensive product that's not actually solving a problem. So, kind of a waste of money for organizations that are already strapped for cash. So we took a very different approach and said, what would it look like if instead of building like an enterprisey, big, clunky, feature-rich software, what if we built a software that had the core functionality that like 90% of grant managers need and stripped it all the way down to just that and then priced it accordingly? So what we ended up coming up with is a software it's mostly on the post-award side. So after money has been given or received. And we integrate with accounting software so we can manage the finances and budgets, like pull that information out of the accounting software and do grant management inside Grantcycle rather than trying to make accounting software like QuickBooks do grant management, which it was never intended to do. And we pull that information in, we pair it up with program finances and budgets, outcome metrics, project management, document storage, and reporting. So you get this really clear picture and you can tell this story that's basically like this transaction, which was funded by this grant, funded this program and produced this outcome. And here's the documentation that says it happened. So you just get this like very linear story inside of a single piece of software.
You mentioned integrations with accounting software. What about into CRMs?
So this is always a fun question. So we have gotten so many questions about whether we integrate with things like Salesforce, like donor CRMs and things like that. And the one question that I always have for people is there an instance where you think a donor and a grant funder will be the same person? And I would bet money on the fact that answer is going to be no, 99.99999% of the time. So one of the really interesting things about nonprofit software is a lot of people have started asking for like one software to rule them all. Like I want to do everything inside of one software. And I actually take the opposite approach. I think software should be to some degree departmentalized, because even the people that are going after donors, that are managing them and asking them for money and dealing with major gifts and things like that, a lot of times are a very different person than the one managing grants. Like that's a finance functionality. And so the issue we had was, if we pull all your donor data in, where's it going to go? What are you going to produce with this information? And so that's a roundabout way of saying, no, we don't integrate with CRMs, with donor CRMs, but there's a specific reason why. And it's just that there's not any information specifically that can be gleaned out of a donor database that would be directly applicable to grants. Now, I do know that some people are like, oh, we manage our grants in our donor CRM. Well, great. We can pull that information out during the onboarding process. And, now you can manage all your grants inside Grantcycle and segregate those two functions.
So generally, I do agree with you. I like the idea of having best of breed, for example, the best accounting software, the best CRM, the best grant management application, the best volunteering application. And generally, those are not found in one particular piece of software because that would be massive. And even Salesforce, being as awesome and cool as it is, doesn't always cover all the bases. So having
Right.
separation of the functionality makes sense to me. Playing devil's advocate, though, tells me or forces me to say that in doing so, you do separate teams and the bigger picture into silos. So someone in the executive branch can't see everything so clearly. They have to go to multiple different systems, get different reports, extracts, and then to have a holistic view of how are we doing kind of conversation gets a bit more fragmented. So, I mean,
Sure.
definitely pros and cons to both sides, but I'm sure you have insights in that as well.
Well, so an interesting thing when you think about this too is I think a lot of people for too long have hated on sort of like the accounting function. That's actually true north. Like if you think about how you're tracking this information inside your accounting software, you're looking at revenue or, income or whatever, words you want to call it. And that's typically for nonprofits divided into things like donated income or grant income or, other types of income. There's your snapshot there. What you're actually getting inside your donor CRM or inside grant management software is the detail. Because the IRS doesn't care about that detail. So it doesn't need to be in your accounting software. And most accounting softwares are not equipped to deal with that level of specificity or with the level of specificity that, more specific products are. And so I think, if you're thinking about something like an annual report, my suggestion is always you start with your accounting software. Don't start with the dedicated platforms. Start with the big picture. What is the breakdown of your revenue according to your accounting software? Because that's what you, file your taxes with. Like that is supposed to be 100% accurate or as close to it as you can get. After that, it's okay. If we're looking at, 80% of our funds are donated, then if I want to know additional detail about that, I can go into my donor CRM and I can get obnoxiously specific based on the things I'm trying to track. And then, if like 20% of our revenue is from grants, then I can go into my grant management software and get obnoxiously specific there. But there are plenty of cases where that level of specificity is not only needed, but it's noise. And so that's why I think certain types of segregated functions are helpful. And also when you look at like scaled up nonprofits, it's very rare. I mean, unless you're dealing with a small one where like they have, 2 employees or something like that. It's not super common to have the accountant and the grant manager and the development person be the same person. So usually they are dealing and they're experts at the specific type of software that their job requires. So I agree with you. I think there's a fine line between careful data segregation and just like absolute siloed chaos. But one thing that we do try to like where we try to steer those things back together is we have these reports called impact dashboards. And so this is where if someone is like, hey, no, I really need this donor information. There are ways that we can still display it like next to grant management information and create basically a story with these dashboards. And we can display some of that donor information there. It's just one of those things where if we're pulling in, if you have like 10,000 records inside your donor database, and now we just got to dump them in somewhere else, you're adding a whole bunch of noise to something that was previously a signal, if that makes sense.
It does. I like where you're going with this, but I really wanted to get into the kind of the next stage of the conversation, which is if you were to inform your 22-year-old self, someone who is quite green to the idea of grants and grant management, what are the major steps that are needed to go through the grant process, starting from how do we even find where to go to, let's say, to find grants? What are the major steps of it? Because that's obviously going to lead into the conversation, which I'm really hoping to get to, is the measuring the impact based on those grants. So
Sure.
Maybe if we could start just with the major steps and then we can flow from there.
Yeah. So honestly, I think one of the hardest parts about grants in general is finding them. There's not a single place anywhere on the internet where you can find all available grants for a specific industry, for all industries. It just doesn't exist. There are paid databases, there are free databases, there are government databases, and all of them are at different levels of quality, pull from different places. It's a dumpster fire of information. And actually, the time it takes to find a single grant that you qualify for averages 3 days, which is insane. I mean, 24 working hours is way too much time to find a grant. So we are working on that as well. More to come on that in future product releases. But yeah, it's just really, really time consuming to find fit with a grant opportunity. Then you have to write the grant, and that can take up to 150 labor hours of writing. And if you don't have a grant writer on staff, it can be really, really expensive. And no, I don't believe AI can write a grant better than a person. So for the time being, grant writing is still going to be very complicated, very manual. Probably I would say at least for the next 10 years until AI can emote as well as a human, which I'm not even sure we want that to happen, but that's a total other conversation. And then lastly is the actual post-award grant management, which is by far the most time-consuming part. So, I mean, it can last a year or more. Some grants are 3 years or 5 years. You have periodic reporting, and some grants are paid as reimbursements. So you don't get the money until you submit the report, and then wait for it to be approved and the funds to actually be submitted. And during that time, you're tracking finances and budgets and documents and your programs, and also doing all the other things it takes to keep a nonprofit moving forward. So yeah, it's a huge, huge industry, with so many different parts that are incredibly complicated.
I'm really tempted to get into that AI conversation just a little bit because I mean, I agree. Today, maybe AI is not yet proficient enough to write grants. But you mentioned a key element that I wanted to ask was for the emoting part. Like, do you think that, I guess that you must feel that that's an important part of the grant writing itself, as opposed to here's the factual elements of it, which is important, I'm sure, as well. But I get the impression that without the emotion, without the story, or without the personal touch, then the grant application kind of falls apart.
I think in the case of nonprofits, yes. In different industries, it's different. Like if you're writing a technical grant application for like scientific research and development, they don't care about your emotion. It all comes down to, your credentials and what you think is going to happen as a result of that research and development. In the case of a nonprofit, you're not doing R&D into homeless prevention, or not, at least in the sense that we would think about it from a scientific perspective. You're dealing with human lives. And that involves a certain amount of emotion. These are people who you can speak to and who can tell you stories of their current situation prior to interacting with your nonprofit, and their situation after interacting with your nonprofit. And I think it requires both. I think grant writing is an art and a science. It's all about persuasion and writing and telling those stories, but it's also a science in the sense that, like, I could weave a beautiful tale, but if my nonprofit doesn't actually do anything, then I have no numbers to back that up, and I'm still not going to get funded. So I think, AI can supply a lot of the more technical things and the maybe making sense of data, but I don't think it can convey a human story because it's not human. It doesn't know what it's like to live in a home and then not live in a home. Even people who've never been homeless can articulate what it would be like to not have 4 walls and a roof over their head. So yeah, I don't think AI is there.
You're right. I mean, it's emulating. It has no real concept of the real world. It just knows
Right.
words and the flow of words and what makes sense in terms of what word should follow another. So there's no model of the real world that it can use to build things, but it can replicate it pretty well these days. And we can disagree on the time frame of how long it will take to get there. I think it's much shorter than 10 years. I'm thinking like 2, 3 maybe. But that aside, at least today, as of this podcast,
Sure.
it's not quite there yet. So,
And I mean, then the questions are, do we want it to be like AI that can emote? I mean, you're pulling at a thread there that you can't put Pandora back in the box, So, I mean, there's just all these other existential types of things that go into to what would have to create, or what would have to be there for AI to be able to write a grant as well as a person.
yeah, that's another conversation. Maybe we can talk about it one day, but that's really cool. And yes, it's existential crisis abound for sure.
Yeah.
So, uh, any other tips in terms of, like, or do you offer any kind of tips aside from the software package? Any kind of like a library of information or a wiki that you can that customers of yours can use to write better grants, or is it something you just normally just outsource or don't get into, and you focus more on the actual process of the grant management?
So I personally have written like 2 grants in my entire life, and I hated literally every second of it. Grant writers are a special breed of people, and I am not of that breed by any means. So we do offer services. One of those is grant writing, but we outsource it. So essentially what we are doing is providing matchmaking services. We have lots of connections to grant writers. And so, if a nonprofit is looking for grant writing, they tell us basically, this is the grant that I want written. We go into our deep bench of grant writers and say, hey, who has experience with this funder, and go through all of that. And then if someone is interested in being the grant writer, they give us a quote. We take it back to the nonprofit. If they say yes, then we serve as a project manager. So the grant writer and the organization aren't having to go do all this back and forth and gather information and everything. We serve as that middleman to make sure that the project gets done on time, and that everything goes smoothly.
That's really great that you offer these kinds of services, because it really helps the end-to-end process, and it's more of a white glove approach, which is, I always advocate for.
For sure.
Before they get awarded the grant, to be awarded the grant, I imagine there's more than one nonprofit that would apply for it. There is only one grant to receive. So obviously there's some kind of determination process that happens on their side. And then once the grant is awarded, what would you say, besides celebrating, what would you think would be the next best steps that a nonprofit can do? Obviously understand the conditions for the grant, like you said, mentioned earlier, reporting. But then once they receive the actual money, what would you recommend as the next best steps to maximize the impact of that grant?
Sure. So I think it actually goes back a little further than that. And I think grant funders have started to recognize this as well, because a lot of newer grant applications ask, what financial controls do you have in place? Do you have grant management software? What is your capacity to actually manage this grant? And so there's just this huge buzzword right now in nonprofits that is, capacity building. And it does, if someone were to drop a $3 million grant in your lap tomorrow, it doesn't mean it would go well. That's a lot of money, and it's a lot of responsibility that you have taken on, and, reporting requirements and things like that. So I think the biggest thing, like in the actual, sourcing and application part of the grant cycle, is to audit your systems and say, if we did win this, what is going to happen? Will we have to rewrite workflows? Will we need to hire someone? Will we have to, what are those long tail consequences? Because obviously everyone wants to win the grant, but a lot of people stop with that idea of, woo, we won it. Yeah, but there's a lot that can go wrong after that. But once you actually win the grant, it's just a matter of being really, really careful about how you track and report everything. You should have documentation for every dollar that is spent, which seems ludicrous, but is often required, especially by state and federal grants. But I think the biggest, the most important part on the post-award side is to remember that your funders don't care about the reports. That's not what they're asking for. They care about the impact that you're producing. They just don't have another way to ask for that. So they're asking for you to report on it. But at the end of the day, they want to create change. So making sure that your workflows and your software and your team is structured in a way that you can actually track and articulate that impact is really, really important.
I'm sensing parallels between grants and being awarded grants and the lottery, in the sense of there are a lot of people who, personally
Sure.
apply. I never played. Well, I shouldn't say that. I talk about it a lot. What would I do if I won the money? But I never actually play, which is
Really?
kind of funny.
Yeah.
Because that's a fun exercise. But that's actually, it's a healthy exercise. And you alluded to it yourself of, if we did win the grant, what would we do with it? Because so many people on the lottery side, they win the money. They have no idea how to manage themselves and manage the money. And then statistically, they end up being better or worse off, rather. several years down
Right.
the road. So you're saying to audit the systems beforehand puts you in a better position to start planning of what if we do get the grant, how would we use it, or what would we need to change internally to have the greatest amount of impact.
Yeah, definitely.
And then I like the idea of the funder wants to know the impact, and the only way that they know how to do that, at least now, I think they know how to do that, is through reports. Would you be able to offer an additional way of being able to provide that kind of feedback that doesn't involve a report?
Yeah. So I think reports, and maybe it's just the name that needs to be overhauled. Or, I mean, I think it's beyond that. I think it's the way that they're asking for this information. Reports are not designed for personality to come through, or for nuance, or for, oh my goodness, we stumbled on this incredible program design that totally changes how, our sub industry could affect change. That none of that comes through. They've stripped it down to numbers, and some impact is just really expensive. If you're trying to end world hunger, it's going to be pricey. And so I think the shift is on storytelling through numbers. You have to have the numbers, but you also have to have room for personality to come through. And so that's why, impact dashboards, I think, have become such a big thing, because you can display the facts and figures in a way that isn't boring. It's like, and it almost has like the wow factor and the sort of magic of an annual report, but without the 2 months of effort that goes into building it. They're real time. They're pulling from, your Grantcycle data, and they are telling that complete story, but in a way that allows you to be you. And I don't know if there's a way for funders to adopt that en masse, because, if you think of like a federal agency giving thousands of grants, if they get thousands of reports back in vastly different formats, how do you compare apples to asparagus? But I think over time, as more and more people adopt software for the grant management function, I think a lot of these reporting things will either lessen or shift.
We're lucky to have on the show a few weeks back someone who talked about impact dashboards a little bit, and you're right, creating that story through a visual graphic and a combination of certain numbers, because numbers by themselves are not very interesting. But I'm curious to know if there's any value in not just only showing reports that have the numbers, but actually indicating, I was going to say CSAT, which is customer satisfaction type of things. But is there any kind of benefit to having some kind of feedback so that the money you allocate to whatever you do, there's some kind of feedback process that you're able to collect data or collect information from people that you have impacted that you can use, like a client testimonial is what I'm getting at. Any kind of,
sure,
would that help?
Yeah,
is that something that can be done?
I think so. So there's this awesome new-ish startup called ProofPact. And that's exactly what they're doing. Basically, the founder was like, you wouldn't go on Yelp and rate a nonprofit. That's weird. Who's doing the rating? Is it a donor? Is it a board member? Is it someone you served? How do you, what would that even look like? And so ProofPact came out of that, and basically it's feedback from all of those various parties, but they can either submit something written or audio or a video and talk about what your organization means to them. And I think that's really, really powerful, because, everyone's familiar with the posters of some starving kid in Africa, and, they're asking for money, and you're like, oh my God, I can visualize that kid. I have kids. That would be terrible. That is compelling. Numbers are not, at least not in the same way. And so I definitely think that getting customer feedback is really, really important, and from all types of customers. Maybe stakeholder impact is a better term. Not just the people you serve, but people who sit on your board and see how the sausage gets made, and donors who see how the money is spent. I think everyone should carry equal weight on discussing the effectiveness of your organization.
And then how would you measure impact if there wasn't such a readily available impact in the sense of, let's say, and I'm making up maybe a hypothetical situation, but let's say we want to optimize, or the organization wants to optimize certain processes, certain systems, technology upgrades, and so forth. How would you then, or is there a way to measure the impact of that, knowing that once the grant has been applied and all these systems have been upgraded, that the nonprofit will become more efficient or more effective and have a greater impact? But that's like part two. It's after that initial phase is complete.
Yeah, I mean, not all impact is sexy. Like, let's be honest. Redoing a process or a workflow to create efficiencies is boring, but it has to happen. And so I think getting away from this whole impact has to be quick, and it has to be multifaceted. Like, impact can be long and it can be binary. It can be we did the thing or we didn't do the thing. And so I think it's also important too for organizations to be really honest and say, we failed. That's okay. Most funders don't care if you failed. They care that you tried, and they care that you know why you failed. And so saying, we're getting this grant for process implementation. I don't even know that there aren't a lot of grants for that, but you can allocate some of the money for that. You just have to be able to articulate what it's going to do for your impact down the road. So impact can be stair steps. So, if we redo this process, it creates the impact that enables us to be able to create impact for the people we serve.
Wow, I didn't even know that was a possibility of claiming that we failed. That seems, it's awesome that you can be that transparent, but wouldn't there be a risk of not being able to apply for another grant or like that? To admit failure is something that I think we're all resistant for, at least to a certain extent. So yeah, like, can you explain more color about it? How would you articulate that in a way that, we tried our best, it didn't quite work out. Here are the lessons learned. Give us another shot. I mean, where do you go from there once you failed?
Yeah, I think honestly, COVID created this shift because, a lot of people got grants during that they were spending down in 2020, and then they couldn't do the things that they were going to do with that money. Or, they were halfway through spending down a grant and they were like, well, we weren't able to create the same impact because fewer people were able to receive our services. And funders started to realize, hey, I don't think we don't care as much about the specifics. We care about learning. Like, if we're all, as a nonprofit industry, collectively trying to get better at creating impact, that implies that we're somewhat less concerned about immediate impact and somewhat more concerned about efficiency of impact over time, or like process improvement, like iterative improvement. So it has opened up this sort of openness to failure, which I think is brilliant. I think it needed to happen long before, 3 years ago. But for a nonprofit to say, hey, we tried this experimental thing. It did not go well. Great. Like, Edison tried 1,100 filaments to get the light bulb filament. Like, okay, eventually you're going to stumble on the right thing. So yeah, I think just being really transparent and honest. But I think one of the important things to keep in mind is don't wait until the final report. If you're failing as you go, talk to your funder and say, hey, this is not going the way we thought it would. We've tried a few different things. Do you have any suggestions? Would we be allowed to change the budget and try something different? What is allowed inside of the terms of this grant contract? Rather than waiting until the end and trying to pretend like you did something that you didn't. I think a lot of funders are more likely to punish what they see as you being non-transparent versus you just being like, yep, we failed. We want to try this other thing. Are you willing to fund that?
I really like that idea of collaboration, that it's not just we receive money from the funder and we go off and do our thing and then report on the outcome once it's finished. But having that regularly scheduled, let's say, feedback mechanism to say, all right, we're doing well. All of a sudden, we're not doing so well. Oh, we're going to crash, help, and adjust as needed, to me is that's a wonderful concept, actually. I'm really happy to hear that it's either recommended or it's enforced, and I just didn't know about it because I always thought it was we get the money and then run away and do the best we can with that.
Sure. Yeah, it has been that way for a really long time. But if you think about it, so being in the tech industry, I think about sort of the fundee perspective in a very different way, which is like investors and, who have equity in the company. And I have meetings with them weekly. Like they are all over me in a good way to produce. And so it's truly a collaboration. Like in the industry, we talk about it as like almost like a marriage. Like when you're picking your investors, you have to be okay with the fact that you are essentially, in a business perspective, married to this person for the foreseeable future. And I think in the nonprofit sector, I think that equivalent is starting to happen there as well, where funders are like, no, listen, like we don't want to just be Daddy Warbucks who's like, here's your money, go away. We want to know you. Like we want to be involved in this impact. We are as invested in this as you are. And we know that every day inside a nonprofit is scary and hard and an uphill battle. And we want to join you on that. And so I think, and again, I think COVID had a lot to do with this. I think it had a lot to do with everyone becoming more collaborative. And so they really want to be along for the ride. So include them. It will be much easier to get along with them. It will be much easier to get money from them in the future when they've seen you struggle and then succeed versus just seeing you as a one-dimensional piece of paper with a report on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it also sounds like based on those kinds of conversations, there is an opportunity for, let's say, additional funds where if the funder does believe that there's goodness happening here, but they need a little bit more than they plan for, the nonprofit plan for, it sounds like there is a possibility of asking for more. It's again, not one set and done. There is a fluidity to it on both sides where if the funder really wants to have maximum impact, and that's the reason why they're giving the grant to begin with, then it makes sense to me to be a bit flexible, saying, all right, you guys thought you needed, let's say, 3 million you mentioned earlier, but you actually need 4 million, and that'll really get you to the goal. Let's make this happen and make that adjustment. It sounds, that's a beautiful collaboration.
Yeah, and it may not be that, you might have to wait until the next cycle for their grants, but yeah, anyone who feels invested in what you're doing is going to be far more likely to give you another grant in the future.
On that note, then, how does a nonprofit like measure the cost of change? Like when it's
very carefully.
Yeah, I'm sure. We talked a bit about systems and processes. I mean, it could be about building renovations too, right? Like it's
sure.
There are a lot of variables, a lot of factors. Are there any kind of tips you can offer, or any trends you've seen in terms of how to effectively price things?
Yeah, so I think the key here is there's a difference between outputs and outcomes. And I think when a lot of people think of outcomes, what they're actually thinking of is outputs. So if you think of, I'll give you an actual concrete example. So in the town that I live in during COVID, there was homeless shelter that opened up, a homeless shelter for homeless individuals who had COVID, because it went through, the town I live in has a very high homeless population, or a very large homeless population. And COVID went through them like crazy because, they're living in close quarters with each other and all of that. And they needed somewhere to go. Like they were super, super sick and on the street. And obviously that's not a good place when you're healthy. Definitely not great when you have, 103 fever. And so one of the things that went into this is they had to renovate a big old warehouse, and they had to put in showers and bathrooms and, get more beds and all of these other things. If I'm asking someone to fund showers and beds, nobody cares. If I'm asking someone to get homeless individuals who are very, very sick and potentially dying of COVID off the street, there you go. That's a very, very different thing. An output is the renovations and the meals and the showers and the beds. The outcome is getting people off the street and getting them healthy. So I think it's framing. Sometimes people are zoomed in way too far and they're looking at a single tree when they're actually standing in a forest. And so really understanding the difference between inputs, outputs, and outcomes, and seeing how all these things work together, I think just makes it a much more compelling story that people want to fund.
That makes total sense. Yeah. And you said inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So there's two on the output side, but only one on the input side. I'm just curious, is there any version of an outcome on the input side?
Not that I can think of. Yeah, it does. No, I think there's just a lot of different types of inputs. So if you think of the inputs, it could be human capital. It could be donated money. It could be grant money. It could be volunteers' time. There's so many different things that could go into the input side. So no, I can't think of a pre-outcome type of thing. I mean, honestly, I think if I had to come up with something, I think it's your previous learning. That's your jumping off point to decide what inputs you need to put into the next program or project.
And that's a great segue to my next question, which is what should a nonprofit track, aside from everything else that they need to track? If this is like the first or the earliest grant that they're applying for, and they know they're going to apply for future grants at some point in time, what would be some kind of way of measuring or tracking how they're applying the grant, like the whole process, let's say, so that the subsequent grant at some point down the future is even more effective?
Yeah, picking outcomes is really, really hard, especially at the beginning. So I think it's important to not try to boil the ocean. Don't pick all the outcomes and track them. Outcome tracking can be really, really expensive if it's done really, really tediously, whether that's, a time expense or an actual dollar cost expense. So I think it's important to start with your mission, because that's everything needs to tie back to that anyway. So, using the example of a homeless shelter, which I don't know why I always use that as an example for some very weird reason, but here we are. So if I'm thinking of homeless shelter and I have a program that is jobs related. So, my hypothesis is if I get people into a job and earning money, they're less likely to be homeless. Then there's a few things that I would want to track around that, just inside of one of those types of programs. Like, where did they start from? Where, who got a job? How long did they stay in that job? Now, these are very not clear-cut outcomes, whatever, like SMART goals. Like, they need to be measurable and you need to be able to track them and all that kind of stuff. But around those types of things, what does the ideal post-program look like? And how do you work your way back to that? And sometimes it's very much like, I just need a person to answer like a yes, no type of binary outcome. Sometimes it's a survey. Like, that's why so many human service organizations have surveys that they fill out after they, have a meeting with a client to get all this really, really robust information. But it cannot stop there. It cannot stay on paper. It cannot be stuck in a filing cabinet where you go back and look at a piece of paper. Like, that stuff has got to be put into a system that can pull information out of that. Because if you can track that person through every interaction and say, hey, in a year, this person went from homeless without a GED to having a GED, working at Walmart, making X dollars per hour, and now we're getting them into an apartment. That's massive. But trying to start, like, if you just looked at that story and tried to figure out what outcomes to track, it can be really, really difficult. So go back to your mission, start there. Think about your vision of what the future looks like if, you're spending this money on this particular program, and just work backwards from there. Find 2 or 3. And then as your organization gets bigger and better, you will know, first of all, if those were not the right outcomes to track, which is entirely possible. Or you'll know if you need to add additional ones into the mix.
And just for context, because GED is not such a popular acronym, at least not for me, it's General Education Development.
Yeah.
It's like a high school. Is it a high school diploma? Or
yeah,
is it just...
high school equivalent. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that it's hard to find places to find grants, like where to apply for grants. And I'm curious to know, I mean, obviously it's a need to the point where you're alluding to something happening in the future for Grantcycle. But at the moment, is there like, do you have any insight of why it's so difficult, particularly in the US and Canada, to find grants? Like, why isn't there like a central repository, or wouldn't that be great if there was a central repository? Any insights on why at the moment it's complicated?
I think it's because everyone thinks they can do something better than someone else, which sometimes is true. But if you look at the databases out there, one of the complicating factors, and this is also why a tech company hasn't come out with a solution for this type of thing yet. The data is non-standard. So if you go to grants.gov and you look at the fields that they record for each grant, so the things that you can sort and filter on, They're vastly different than you get from like Foundation Center by Candid, which is vastly different from a family foundation's website. And so part of the problem is when you're dealing with non-standard data and you're dealing with words fundamentally having different meanings across different industries, it makes it really, really, really difficult to bring everything together. The problem is as we were saying just a second ago, collaboration has gotten huge. Nonprofit, public, nonprofit, private, public, private. So before you could just stick to, the nonprofit databases. You can't now, because if you have, a public sector sponsor or partner, you now qualify for a whole bunch more. And so in actually improving how money is spent, they made it more complicated to find money to spend. So it's a problem that technology has grappled with for a while. And I think AI is finally going to solve that. I've been hating on AI, so score one for AI now. And it's a really complicated problem. So, short answer, no, I don't know of any good places to start. Start locally. It just at least makes the pool smaller. Start with your city and county and your state, and then the federal agency that most closely pertains to what you do. And, that's still a huge bit of information to wade through, but it's not everything.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what potential possibilities will lie in the Grantcycle application.
Definitely. Same.
So I'm curious then to know, aside from that feature, what other insights can you offer today on what is in your short-term future, either for yourself personally or for Grantcycle?
Yeah, in the short term, this year is a lot about integrations. You talked earlier about the siloed data, and that's just a problem everywhere. I think it's felt more in the nonprofit sector because there's not a lot of technology built for nonprofits. So they're repurposing public sector or private sector technology for their own uses, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So you end up with a lot of tools. And obviously we don't want to be another tool that someone's using. So integrating with other things so that, if you have a large team that's using different things, they don't have to have another thing to log into. They can just, their software will show what they need out of Grantcycle, and Grantcycle will show what's needed out of, the other software. But more longer term, the goal is really, how do we get to real-time impact? How do we get as close to that as possible? A few years ago, Elon Musk, for all of his faults and successes, asked this really compelling question of, he said, if you can tell me how much it'll cost to end world hunger, I'll write you a check. That is not a number you can quantify. That is not a number you can back up. There's nowhere to even begin. And that's the problem. We're throwing money at problems and expecting solutions to just sprout out of the ground like flowers or something. Like, that's just not how it works. This takes careful consideration and people who know how to spend money really, really efficiently and effectively. And so what we're looking at is, if you can automate all of the little things that go into grant management so that your focus is purely on impact, then you can start to say, why is my organization more or less efficient than a similar organization? Is there something they're doing that's better? Can I crowdsource program design so that we can collaboratively do this stuff better? So a dollar goes even further. And so we can actually solve large scale problems.
Ansley, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for your insight. I'm curious, or if you could please share where people can find more about you, more about Grantcycle, and if they have any follow-up questions, how can they get in touch with you online?
For sure. So you can check out Grantcycle at grantcycle.com. If you have any questions, there's a little chat bot there that will actually go to me. And so, any questions, I am more than happy to answer. Also love connecting with people on LinkedIn. Just like shoot me a message and we can get connected. But I'm a huge data nerd, grant nerd, love talking about this stuff. And I really, really love where the industry is headed from a technology perspective.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.